Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Beat the Big Guys. Hi, I'm your host, Sandy Rosenthal, and my guest today is a best-selling investigator, and his name is Gerald Posner. Hi, Gerald.
Hey, Sandy, great to be with you. Fantastic to be on your podcast and especially with you, with your own work after Hurricane Katrina and what you stood up to. You showed how it's possible for one person to make a difference. And I like to think that in my own way, I'm showing that in different subjects all the time. And the last one was on the drug industry.
Yes, you did. I've read your most recent book, and since I know a lot about you, but our guests do not, so I'm just going to tell them a little bit about you before we start, okay?
All right.
Okay, here we go. Gerald Posner is an attorney turned investigative author. He is a Pulitzer Prize finalist. That is very cool. And a New York Times bestselling author of 13 books, ranging from the biography of Ross Perot to reinvestigations of the JFK and Martin Luther King assassinations, as well as books about 9/11, Saudi Arabia, and the Vatican. Gerald's most recent book, which I've read cover to cover and we are going to talk about today, is about the American pharmaceutical industry. And I'm going to close with this one last remark made about Mr. Posner. According to the Chicago Tribune, Mr. Posner is a merciless pit bull of an investigator.
Gee,
Good.
Sandy, you're going to appreciate this. So, some people who don't do investigative work or don't stand up against large corporations or whatever might think that being called a merciless pit bull of an investigator isn't a great thing. A merciless pit bull doesn't sound good. For me, that was one of the best compliments that a review could give. It's exactly what I like to think, that you're sort of the tenacious person you've got to be because you're talking about industries or events that are much, much larger than just a single person or a small group of people standing up. And if you're not tenacious, if you don't bite in and hold on, if you don't stay with it, if you're not persistent, you're not going to get anything because they are accustomed to wearing people down. They're accustomed to sort of throwing up so many obstacles that eventually the little person will say, oh, forget about it. You know what? I've got a life to live. I've got bills to pay. I can't deal with this. They've got too much arrayed against me. And yet, at a certain point, they do get a little bit, and I'm using they in a very broad sense here to cover everything from the federal government to private industry like pharma. They do get a little nervous when they have a real fighter chasing them because they have things to hide and they know that if you're persistent enough, you may not come up with everything, but you're going to find enough to cause a ruckus.
Uh-huh. They may be sitting there, for all you know, they're sitting there in their offices going, whoa, thank God they didn't find this or that. They've already found this and it's coming. But I think you hit the nail on the head that just not giving up is maybe 90% of the secret of beating the big guys. Just don't give up.
I think that's absolutely true. Look, in my view, and you're right, worked together with my wife Trisha on 15 books, and there's always some point in the middle of a project. There was on the book on the drug industry, in which I say usually to her, she's like her broken record. She knows it's coming. I say, oh, I can't finish this. We can't do it. We're at a block point. We're not getting any information, not getting new interviews, not getting any assistance. We just can't do it. And she says, well, you're not going to do it if you just sit here and complain about it. Get back in the room and keep working, type of thing. And it's true. And because if you there is that point at which this isn't a straight line. Somebody picks up the book on pharma and they read it from page one to the end. They think it's a straight line, that all you did is you sat down, you did some research, you made some freedom of information requests, you called up some people, did interviews, and then you wrote that story. They don't know how many lines of inquiry we went down over a 5-year period that ended up in a dead end. Don't know how many people we spoke to where we thought they were going to have documents that would be fantastic and they didn't get it. So, for everything that I end up finding, yes, there's something else. I think, oh, if I had only gotten that. But you get as much as you can, and it's not. There are points in which any of us, no matter, I pay the bills by doing this, and still there are points in which you want to throw your hands up and say, oh, I should have an easier project. So I do think that you're right. When you say 90% of it is sticking with it,
Mhm.
that's absolutely true.
And I want to, I'm just going to add one thing. Everything, I agree with everything, but I will add that even when you think you've wasted your time, I'm talking to those of you out there listening, even if you think you've gone down a rabbit hole and wasted your time, no, you didn't. You're going to find out when you reach the finish line that that rabbit hole you needed to go down, though what you thought was wasted time was not.
Yeah, I think
Mhm.
that's absolutely true. And in the business of doing reporting or journalism or doing a book, it's extremely important because sometimes I'll chase a line of inquiry that I think is going to be productive, and for whatever reason it's not. But like you said, along that way, I may meet somebody or make a
Mhm.
contact that comes in important on something else. And
Mhm.
often, stories come back. So something that didn't really flesh out as a story originally, somebody comes back to you later and they say, by the way, I've left Pfizer. I'm no longer there. I can talk to you now about this or that or whatever it is. And then you have a story that you can write for a newspaper or magazine. It may not be an entire book. So I always am a firm believer that I view it not as sort of dead ends, although they may be, but as planting little seeds here and there
Mhm.
across the topic, and then some of those seeds sprout later than you expect them to.
Absolutely. So we are going to, I'm going to hand the mic over to you, and you can just tell our listeners about your book. But before, speaking of Twitter, you mentioned you posted something to Twitter. Well, you posted something on Twitter about 3 weeks ago that I just can't stop thinking about it. So you wrote, and I quote, "Whenever I worry that my office is an overstuffed and unorganized mess, I look at this pic and somehow feel better. Misery loves company." Well, now I can't get your office out of my mind.
It's a fabulous thing. So there's this wonderful process that takes place, and this is the good thing. I've been with Trisha for 42 years now, and the great thing is the difference between somebody who's organized, Trisha, somebody who's not organized in terms of paper. So I sort of stack papers up, and I think I know what's in that pile, and then they stack up over here, and then you walk in between them, and then in the middle of a project, oh my God, they're all the way up to the ceiling, and it looks like it's about to fall. And Trisha is very good about staying on track to make sure we don't get buried in paper. So eventually I do pull out, but there is a point on at every project. So this is also of some interest for your listeners, and they're going to split on this. And this might be a generational thing. I grew up on paper. Meaning, I went to school on paper. I grew up on paper. I mark up books. I grab a book like yours, Words Whispered in Water. I'll mark it up with, yeah, pharma. Okay, I hear it. You do mark it up on paper. I can mark up a PDF. I can circle and everything else, but it doesn't stick in my mind the same way. So I often get PDFs or Freedom of Information files from the government now in electronic form, and then I print them out. So it doesn't save me necessarily. The paperless office doesn't exist here for me.
Well,
Um,
you're forgiven. You
all
can
right, fair
you
enough.
can kill a tree because you're doing so much good work with that. So, oh, and by the way, I beat you. I've been married 43 years.
That's fantastic. No, it's great. So there's a thing, I do think that the wonderful thing about, and you'll all understand it, those of you who have long-term relationships, they're great. Life is tough enough, but if you do have somebody who's in your corner, there's usually nobody more in your corner than your spouse. It's fantastic to know that's always there. So, it's
Support is great, and we do need it very, very much. So, I'm going to turn the mic over to you, and you go ahead and just tell our readers about why you wrote your book and what it's about, and because I'm just dying to hear it from you.
so the I wrote the book in part. I had actually proposed this idea for a book to publishers a number of times beforehand, and the general response had been the drug industry uh, is too broad, it's too big. Well, that's exactly, Sandy, why I wanted to do it. Because there had been all these books about drugs. There are books about the FDA. There are books about expensive drugs. There are books. There's a book called Bad Pharma. There are all these books over time, but nobody was crazy enough or had the overarching ambition to try to do the story of the drug industry in America from the time that it started, after the Civil War, and when it was essentially selling just morphine, and all drugs were legal. So everything from heroin, which is a trademark name from Bayer, to barbiturates, which Bayer discovered, everything could be bought over the market without a prescription. And cannabis was legal. Things were mixed in. Didn't have to prove that it was safe or anything else. That was the Wild West of the drug days. And that's when the companies like Charles Pfizer and all the companies we know today started in the US, most of them selling morphine because there was a great demand for it after the Civil War. And then I wanted to take the drug industry through the point in which it had nothing at all to offer. And then they finally came up with insulin in the early 20s. And the big discovery turns out to be this miracle discovery in World War II of penicillin. And how do we go from a time when penicillin, this miracle drug, is being offered with no company owning the rights to it? It's very, very cheap to get, to a point where companies have patents and exclusive selling rights and drugs are very expensive. And the drug industry as a whole goes from a tiny little portion of American commerce to be the biggest and most profitable industry in the country. That's the tale I'm trying to tell. Through the periods of Valium and the hits of OxyContin and opioids and drug pricing and cartels being run, bad behavior. In the end, this is a history of innovation in the lab by people who are really, really clever at times, and they come up with cures occasionally that save lives. Fantastic. And then that runs into the greed in the boardroom of overpricing, of gouging for prices, and sometimes taking advantage. And the reason that I get so incensed about it, and I think you do, I know that you're a fighter on this, and I think that many of your listeners do, is we've all been the victim of the drug industry by, if we take a medication, if we go ahead and we have a pill, whether it's for blood pressure or diabetes or whatever else, we're paying a price often too high. People have trouble paying the prices. Diabetes medication and insulin was discovered in 1922, and yet Lilly, who had the rights to it, kept extending the patent for 40 years by sort of gaming the system. Today, insulin is higher and more expensive than ever before at a time when you think it's generic and should be cheaper. And the part of the story that I think is so frustrating that I try to lay out in this book is that this is a business like no other. And what I mean by that, you'll hear people come up and they say, oh, I'm writing about aerospace, or I'm writing about Wall Street or whatever. It's a business like no other. But the reason this one is normally we have businesses that sell directly to consumers, whatever their product is, cars, tires, the stocks, you name it. In the drug business, the manufacturers of the product who are marketing it and pricing it don't sell directly to us, the consumer. They have to go through this middle person, the doctors. So the doctor has to write the prescription. So they're selling to the doctors. They're getting them to write the prescriptions. At the same time, they're spending billions of dollars on advertising to us, the consumers, even though we can't go out and fill a prescription on our own. They want us to go into the doctor and say, hey, I turned on the TV tonight. I just saw a great new ad for migraines. I have a migraine. Maybe I should be taking that latest and greatest medication. And the doctor writes the script. So they know how to do it. And the last wrinkle of this, which makes it so sort of frustrating and aggravating in a way, is that only in the United States, nowhere else in the world, do we allow drug companies to have unfettered pricing power. In every other country, in Western Europe, in Asia, and others, there's some entity set up to try to negotiate prices. Now, the Biden administration's finally passed a rule that in 2 years, Medicare will start to negotiate 10 of the most expensive drugs. That's a step forward. But before that, US drug prices are set for the highest amount they can be. We pay them and we grumble all the time when we feel we're helpless against it. That's why I wrote this book.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I will tell everybody that the book is not light, fluffy reading. I have read it. The description of the book is officially that I found online. It was published in 2020 to rave reviews. Pharma, Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America. A withering and encyclopedic indictment of a drug industry that often seems to prioritize profits over patients. Reads like a pharmaceutical version of Cops and Robbers. This is the New York Times. So again, it's not light reading. It's very, very data dense. I will tell everyone that. But this is about an epic scale scandal and also a tragedy.
Though, it's very interesting you say that. Yes, you're right. it's a long book and it's got footnotes and it's got a lot of source notes and everything else. And the reason for that is because without that, the pharmaceutical industry would rip it apart.
Mhm.
They would come in and they say, "Oh, what? This is an opinion piece. This is somebody's unsupported, unfactually supported." So you know what? When I talk about an issue, I cite the study in the back, not necessarily for the lay reader who just wants to get the story, but for the pharma exec who wants to make sure that I got it right. So they can't get, and they never came back and said, "Oh, by the way, you got that wrong."
So this is a great time to bring this up, and we're gonna talk later about Kirk and the letter that got cited. No one bothered to find out
Oh yeah, right,
the Porter and
right.
okay. So
Dixon Porter.
yeah, we're going to discuss that letter in a moment. But the big guys, whoever they are, don't expect people will actually read. That the last thing that they expect is going to happen. But what's interesting is when you wrote your book, you weren't worried about me checking your facts. You were concerned about big pharma checking your facts,
Yeah,
and
yeah, exactly.
they're the only ones that are going to check your facts. Everyone else is going to believe you.
Yeah,
I hope
although I
so.
tell you that I think that, one of the things is you have to, if you want to, as an investigative reporter, my feeling is you have an obligation to try to not just present the book as a read, but also present where you've gone to for your information. The reason I say that is that there's a difference, and I guess I'm old-fashioned in this. I'm a dinosaur. I still think there's a difference between what I call secondary sources and primary sources. And what I would say is that, let's say that tomorrow, the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal publishes an article that says, by the way, drug prices are too expensive and 20% of drugs are ridiculously priced. I cite that as the source in my book. I don't know how they came to that conclusion. I'm telling you what they said. So what I try to do is
So
go to
that's
the
secondary.
right, the primary sources. That's what I'm trying to do. So I get to the sources underneath that, and that may seem a little eggheady at times, but that's where you actually determine whether, in fact, I'm such a cynic that even if I see something printed that I think, oh, I like that, I agree with that, but I want to know how did they come to that. So a lot of time is spent on getting that right.
I think that's really important. I once, in my battle, real quickly to show you how this happens all the time, show the listeners, there was a well-known news source in New Orleans called the New Orleans Lens, and they made the statement, well, local officials were responsible, were partly, at least in part, for the levee failures and flooding. And then when I asked for source data, this is a media company, they said, oh, well, everybody knows that.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah. The
Well, it ought to be really easy to find something to back it up if everyone knows it. And of course they couldn't at the end, and I go more into it in my book, but I asked for it. So I wanted the primary source.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. You're right, and often people don't do that. One of the ways you can do that is in the book, and so I think that that happens to be key in some ways in presenting your information.
Absolutely. So in your book, you pointed out how pharmaceuticals wasn't even listed as a category in the Moody's financial rating firm in around 1930. Wasn't even
The
a category.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. So Moody starts, by the way, in 1909. Moody's is the company,
Right.
ranks by industry and tells you how big they are. They don't even have pharma listed as an industry. It was a subset of the chemical industry. It was such a small player, and that's because they didn't have any products. They had the products. They were selling them before 1914, but those were the products mixed with all banned substances like opioids and later heroin and all of the things that were then available. Once we banned those in 1914 under the Harrison Act, they're left without products. And they do come up with insulin, as I said, in 22 in Canada. So one company, Lilly, gets the right to distribute that. But otherwise, it's an industry looking for a product. And the product turns out to be penicillin in World War II. By the decade after the end of World War II, by the end of the 1950s, this pharmaceutical industry, which wasn't even listed in 1930,
Right.
had become the most profitable in the US of any post-war industry. It had boomed. It was the golden years for them.
That was the statistics that really stood out to me. And there was another one. Can I ask you another question?
Yep.
So on page 61, you spoke about John McKean, who was the chairman for Pfizer. And around 1949, he noticed that all the scientists get the same salary, all the scientists working to find new drugs. whether they all got the same salary, whether they made a Nobel Prize winning discovery or if they found nothing, which in my mind is very ethical in my mind. But McKean, quote unquote, he wanted to empower the sales and marketing division with the authority to guide the scientists, who are the experts, toward medicines that might sell best.
It's a fantastic thing because Jack McKean comes up inside the business, so he becomes chairman of Pfizer, and he has a very different view of medicine than some of the other CEOs at that time. So in the 50s, Merck was run by the great great grandson of the original founder of Merck. He had a view that if you owned a drug company, it was a quasi-public trust because you were providing a public benefit, public health. At the same time, you were earning a profit. You had to sort of balance those two. Guys like McKean said, what about balance? I'm serving shareholders. I'm going to return as much profit as possible. Why are those scientists and researchers inside my laboratories looking for what they think might be the best thing to develop to assist people for health when we could, in the marketing department, guide them to what we think we need to sell it? McKean was the one who came up with the idea that even a mediocre medication could be a bestseller. And to prove that, his own company had gone ahead and come up with their first antibiotic that they were able to get a patent on, a thing called terramycin. This is in the late 50s. It was one atom of difference from the competitor's product. And it made no difference in the effect on the patient. So you took both products, it was the same. The therapeutic, the way they were dosed was the same, but they had a patent on it. So McKean said, how do I make this sell, even though it doesn't have any advantage? And he hired a guy called Arthur Sackler, that may ring a bell for some listeners. Sackler's the company that later does OxyContin. And he was a marketing genius. And Arthur Sackler comes in and rolls out what I call the hard sell. Sends out drug reps to the doctors, which we got used to over time, to try to convince the doctors to come along. He has direct mailers, color ads inside the medical journals. He's spending money on direct calls. And he takes Jack McKean and Pfizer's mediocre, no difference antibiotic and makes it the top selling antibiotic in the country. And that convinced the other drug CEOs, oh my goodness, it's not necessarily about the quality of the drug. It's about how you market it. And so McKean led a revolution together with Sackler that was not a good one in the drug business because it put the emphasis on selling as much as creating it.
Yeah, you continue with that on page 93, where you wrote that Pfizer's salespeople were taught that while technical knowledge is important, it was also, quote, important to cultivate a personal connection with the doctors they visited, unquote.
And you know, I think that's absolutely critical because one of the things that happens is in the 1950s, you had originally had about 400 drugs that had been approved by the FDA. And then over time, you have several thousand drugs that have been approved by the FDA. Doctors can't keep up with it. Now, forget, even if you're a specialist, if you're only doing blood workup, if you're only doing orthopedics, or you're only doing neurosurgery, you specialize in your field, but there are still 24 drugs in the pipeline and others that come out. You can't run your practice, pay the insurance, keep on track of all your patients, and also read everything published on the drugs. So the drug reps became the way that you got your information. And if you happen to like a drug rep, if you thought they were trustworthy, if they came in, they asked about your kids, did you go golfing? How was your vacation, by the way, that you took to Canada? And you felt as though they were buddies. You didn't necessarily think they were selling you. And so in an odd way, those personal relationships, and Sackler and other people who marketed drugs became proficient in this. Develop the friendly relationship. The local doctor trusts you. They'll listen to you when they say, try this new drug. And that happened time and time again.
And they'll listen to you when they said that this addictive drug, they listen to you when an addictive drug, they tell you is not addictive, and they will listen to you. So which brings us to the Sacklers, which we haven't talked much about today. I'm pretty sure that all of our listeners are aware of the Sackler family and how they were at the center of the opioid crisis and largely responsible, not just them, but they were very responsible for the crisis. And before I read your book, in my mind, the central villain was Richard Sackler, Arthur Sackler's nephew, in my mind. But having read your book, he was not alone.
Right.
by any
He
stretch.
was the heir. He was the heir to the entire thing. I mean, he picked it up and ran with it, but he didn't create it that way.
No, and that's and secondly, it's the entire Sackler family, and third, it's not just the Sackler family. What's been going on in the pharmaceutical industry been going on for about 100 years, how we got here.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely right. And what's interesting is that, I always say that I focus a lot, and you know that, on the Sackler family in the book, and their story is a disgraceful one. And I still think that they've gotten away with it, even though they paid several $billion of their OxyContin profits to as part of a bankruptcy settlement for their company. They still left with billions of dollars. Nobody has brought criminal charges against them. They walked away free. So
Right.
they did get away with it, but they aren't, as you said, the only
Not
ones
alone.
responsible. The other pharma companies had their own opioid products. You also had overprescribing doctors. You had doctors who were running pill mills, which were essentially legal drug dens. You had an FDA that wasn't strict enough about trying to crack down on what was happening. You had drug distributors, multi-billion-dollar companies like Cardinal and McKesson, and those who knew where every pill in America went and weren't reporting it to the FDA. You had pharmacies, national pharmacy chains like Walgreens and CVS and others, who have been fined by the FDA because they weren't watching and controlling the prescriptions enough. So there's plenty of blame to go around on the OxyContin opioid problem. The thing that's interesting is when you look at it from the business point of view, you had essentially the person who created hospice, which we've all had some experience with if we've had a relative or somebody elderly die, who was a nurse turned to a physician in England, Cicely
Saunders.
the Saunders. She's an amazing woman. She had created hospice in the mid 60s, and she was looking for something. It wasn't going to work unless she could come up with a long acting pain reliever, because otherwise they had to give you the equivalent of morphine every 3 to 4 hours. They had to give that IV in a hospital. So the only way she could get people home so they could spend their last weeks with their family was to give them a longer acting pain reliever. And who develops that pain reliever? The British subsidiary of the Sackler family. In the late 1970s, they come up with morphine in 12-hour doses in a pill. It's revolutionary for hospice. But what do? When they bring it over to the United States, eventually they market it. And then the Sackler family, Richard and others, have an idea. Well, we could come out with a new product. And instead of being morphine, which people think has a terrible reputation, you hear morphine, you think end of life, oh, it's terrible. Let's put hydrocodone in it, which is the ingredient in OxyContin, and let's market it as a new type of pill for more pain, not just end of life terminal cancer pain, but we will market it aggressively from everything from back pain to chronic back pain to seizures to osteoarthritis, you name it. And that's OxyContin, released in 1996. What was different, what the Sacklers had, was a patent that no other company had, and that was the long-acting time-release formula. So all of their competitors for opioids were instant-release pain, Percocets, things like that that you would take, would last for 3 to 4 hours, and that was the end of it. You'd have to take another one. With the Sackler pill, it claimed to be two a day. Didn't quite last that long, but that's what the claim was. And that's what their marketing genius was, to come out with that, sell it to doctors as a revolution, minimize the risk of addiction, at the same time overstate the conditions for which it should be treated. And what's the result? Billions of dollars in profits and hundreds of thousands of people dead over time.
Right. It was brilliant, but that's tongue in cheek, that
Yeah,
claim.
diabolically,
Yeah,
diabolically
diabolically
brilliant.
brilliant.
I say that. That's right. So, we say sometimes when I say something like, and you're right, because people can misinterpret that. When I say that's brilliant, I do mean diabolically. I condemn it and I disagree with it and I think it's terrible. And dissecting it, we can understand how it happened and how it was responsible. It's not as though in the drug business, you can't just come out and say, okay, I'm going to take a product that's lethal and terrible. Somebody can't come out tomorrow with a new fentanyl patch that is killing people and market it for all types of pain without others not doing their job, without the FDA failing to do its job, without Congress failing to come in at some point, the health organizations. So, as I say, the system is built to have checks and balances, and one of the frustrating parts about the drug industry story is that it doesn't have those checks and balances work a lot of times.
Or they were in name only, that they weren't doing their job, or they were stymied, or
That,
Yeah, but they basically were unfettered. I mean,
that
I remember, I don't remember what page I read it, but there was a section of your book that said that doctors have totally unfettered discretion um, with terminally ill patients. They
yeah,
can do whatever they want.
yeah,
You
right.
give them whatever they want,
Yes.
which
So two things on that. First, before when you say, and you're right, on the regulators don't regulate all the time, but one of the things that's a problem, and I talk about this in the book, and then I get over to the doctors and their sort of unfettered power, is we have this door, and I call it a revolving door. It's not really revolving, it's one way. It goes from government service to the drug industry. So you serve at the FDA for a while, then you get to go over to the drug industry in some position in which you have a big money job, 3 times the salary you were earning in the government. It's not a revolving door because they never go back to government service or very seldom do. Curtis Wright, that name may not ring a bell to many people, but you'll know this. Curtis Wright was the FDA officer who approved OxyContin in 1996. He gave the drug company extraordinary wording on their label that it might be less prone to being abused because of its long 12-hour release. No studies to prove that. Where was he a couple of years later? He had left the FDA and he was working as a senior officer at Purdue Pharma, the manufacturer of OxyContin. That's the type of thing that makes the public lose trust in the entire process. And as for doctors, this is one of the oddest things in the drug industry. I'm glad you pointed this out. It gets lost in all of the other stories and facts. Is the FDA has this process where it makes companies go through clinical trials and safety trials in 3 different levels to try to show that the drug is effectively safe. It's not going to kill someone. We know what the side effects are and that it's therapeutic, that it's effective. And then they have this enormous loophole that says, oh, by the way, since you're a doctor, we assume that you know enough that you can prescribe a drug off label for any reason you want to. So you can take a drug that's given for asthma, and if you're a doctor, you can say, I think, by the way, that's going to help children from the ages of 7 to 10 grow faster. Let's try giving it to some children in my practice. Drugs are used for all types of different things, and sometimes companies are very happy to let that happen because they don't have to go back to the FDA, prove that it's effective for that purpose.
and
So
they can use the population as the guinea pigs.
that's exactly right. We are the test. We the people who are taking the product are the test product. And very seldom do patients know. So if you go in to see your doctor for an annual physical or you're going for a specific reason, you've got a pain or something else, and the doctor says, I'm going to prescribe you, let's say, gabapentin, which is a drug they give for nerve pain, but it hasn't been approved for the type of pain that you have. You don't know that.
No.
You're not checking the clinical trials. You assume the doctor is doing that. The doctor never says, by the way, oh, by the way, I want you to know I'm prescribing this off label, which means I'm prescribing it for something for which it hasn't been approved. Now, that should be required in my view, but they don't do that.
I've never heard of off label until I read about it in your book. Now,
We,
I did know that Rogaine came from patients had taking heart medication who started growing hair on their body.
right.
I'd heard that, but I didn't know that the doctors were going on their own, said, oh, well, let me start giving this out as to treat hair loss.
Yeah, and so what's
And it's
interesting
and it's
about that,
legal.
you're right. And what so in that case, you literally had Upjohn knowing because Upjohn knows where the sales are going, and they see it at one point going to dermatologists and the doctors who are treating using it for hair treatment. They were making more money after 4 years when the drug was out from its off-label use than they were making for what it had been approved for, which was hypertension. It was supposed to be treating high blood pressure. They finally went to the FDA to get a form of approval for it, but for years they were able to rake in the money. The same thing happened with Botox. So Botox, put out by Allergan, was put out to treat as what's called an orphan drug. They got special money and everything else for a very small patient population to treat these uncontrolled sort of twitches in the eye and also vocal problems in the vocal box in which there were these twitches. That's all. It was a very tiny market. And then somebody discovered when they were giving it for the eye that it reduced the appearance of wrinkles, became a popular off-label prescribing doses for aesthetic offices around the country. They made billions and billions of dollars before the FDA said, hey, why don't you come and do some studies and see if this is safe? Which is, it's the great loophole in the drug business.
It's a great loophole. And speaking of which, you mentioned the Orphan Act, and so that's something else I didn't know about until I read your book. So for you listeners out there, the Orphan Act was passed in 1938, and the reason it was passed, and Gerald, you can elaborate, was there were some patients with rare diseases, and so naturally, it's maybe a lot to ask pharmaceutical companies to invest in all that R&D for diseases that are so rare they'll go broke trying to
Right.
find. So it was passed in 1938. The federal government will pay 70% of the R&D, and so, but it's my understanding, having finished your book, that even that law was designed to help the pharmaceutical industry and to help the patients with rare diseases. Even that got abused.
Yeah, well, so what happened? So, Sandy, it's interesting. You're right. They did talk about it from 38 on. They don't actually get it into law until 83. So think of how many
Oh,
decades it takes.
I
No,
didn't
no,
know
so,
that. I
so
didn't
in
catch
83,
that.
so in 83 they put it in, and the idea is fantastic. And I agree with the idea, which is pharmaceutical companies are for profit, and they aren't necessarily going to, if there's a rare genetic disease, Huntington's disease and others, some of these, they're not going to spend the time in the laboratory to develop a drug to treat that if the patient population is 4,000 people,
And that's
10,000.
understandable.
All right.
That's
And
understandable.
as a
Even an
result, they'll
average
work on
person.
hypertension, they'll work on diabetes, whatever else. So the government said, okay, we're going to do something. We're going to give you some extra incentives. And like you said, we'll pay some of the R&D costs, we'll give you tax credits, we'll give you a 7-year automatic patent of
7 years.
selling rights. Nobody else can compete against you. And in doing that, and they made the patient population no bigger than 200,000. So as long as it's under 200,000, fine. What happened is that drug companies do what any major American corporation would do. They got the lawyers together and they said, okay, figure out how we can game this, meaning not break the law, but use it not just for the intent of serving those patients, but make a little bit of extra money. And extra money meant this. So, for instance, from the very beginning, one of the companies that came up with the first drug to treat HIV, AZT, right after this had been passed, they rushed to get it through as an orphan drug, so it would have all these extra protections and payments when the patient population for AIDS was under 200,000. Nobody in drafting the law had made a provision for what happens if that group grows above 200,000. So that was the test case, and it worked to the benefit of pharma. So as long as you get in while the patient population is small, like if they had gotten in when COVID only affected 50,000 people, doesn't matter if it affects 50 million later, you still have all the benefits of the Orphan Drug Act, and you're
I
getting.
bet someone tried. I
They
bet
did. As
someone
a matter of
tried.
fact, it was very interesting. One of the very first therapeutics that was being proposed by Moderna and then was being proposed by Regeneron, both tried to get them in under the Orphan Drug Act. That was rejected, thank goodness. They were making enough money on other things.
And COVID unfortunately spread so quickly that would have been impossible.
That would have been impossible. But that was one
But
thing they did. And
of
the
course
other
they
thing they
tried.
did, no, and the other thing they did is you're supposed to use the Orphan Drug Act once. They've learned how to make minor modifications to the drugs or to reduce the patient size. So let's say that they have a drug that's very effective that's treating a rare genetic disorder that's affecting 100,000 people. Now they want to get a new patent on it. They make it a pediatric version just for those children that are being affected by it. They changed it over here to do this. Sometimes, for instance, Botox with Allergan, they got the benefit of being an orphan drug, but when it became one of the biggest selling drugs in America for a cosmetic purpose, they didn't have to give back any of the money they got from the government for the orphan drug funding. So it's just something that keeps getting reused time and again. It serves a good purpose, but it's abused. And the problem I have is this: nobody fixes the holes. It would be as if you had leaks in your ceiling, in your faucet, in your pipes, and you never called in anyone to put a piece of tape around it or something to solder it to stop the leaks from coming in. And I'm asked often, who's to blame here? Democrats or Republicans? And I say, tell me what decade you're talking about. Maybe in this decade it's the Republicans, in this decade it's the Democrats. This is a bilateral failure because the drug company is smart enough to lobby both sides of the aisle. They know how to do it. And that's why we don't get these things fixed as often as we should, unfortunately.
Gerald, on page 98, I found out something about you. It turned up that you, the author, uncovered that the Sacklers had a secret control stake in it's a particular company. It's on page 98. Do you remember what I'm talking about? Yeah, that
Yeah,
you discovered the secret
yeah.
control
I mean,
stake.
I will tell you that I think I lost brain cells over a period of time because I was in another room. I could show you a wall that I've used as sort of a whiteboard to try to figure out the connections the Sacklers had hid. They had over a
So
hundred
many.
corporations from the late 50s and on, and they kept building more and more of them. They put them under different names. They had different front owners for them. They held shares secretly that would have been conflicts of interest in companies that were doing medical marketing and at the same time that they were knowing who was getting prescriptions and providing medical information. It is unbelievable the extent to which the family was sophisticated in terms of having this Byzantine corporate sort of labyrinth, having a piece of every part of the pie, so that they made money on drug manufacturing, they made it on promotion, they made it on distribution, they made it on doing testing for the scientists, on laboratories and clinical trials. They even made money when Apollo 11, our first space mission, went to the moon and came back. They convinced NASA to take a product that they had called betadine, which is sort of a disinfectant hand wash, and you didn't want to because they just had the Andromeda strain, which had been published a little bit before that moonshot, by in which we had this absolutely scary idea that maybe some microbe from outer space could come down and wipe out the planet. The Sacklers convinced NASA, why take that risk? Have them come back with betadine. And when the astronauts splashed down in the ocean, they washed themselves down with betadine. They opened up the capsule and they washed down that little floating orange tub before they got into it with betadine. And the Sacklers had tens of millions of dollars of free publicity, which they used all over to make a product that was extremely cheap. All the government hospitals, Veterans Association, everybody else bought it. They made a fortune. So they didn't always have to sell OxyContin. They knew how to make money on all levels of the drug business.
Begrudgingly admiring is the term that comes to mind. You have to admire, even though it's diabolical and begrudging, that they were geniuses in marketing drugs and meanwhile passing themselves off as being there. What we all think of the pharmacy industry as being, there for the greater good.
Yeah,
But go
no,
on.
and I was going to say, and though, Sandy, when you say that, it's very interesting because I would have predicted something wrong. I know occasionally I can get it wrong, even on something I study. And what I mean by that is in 2007, the Sacklers were brought to task. Federal government had brought charges against them for misbranding the drug, Purdue. Three of their top executives pled guilty to that. They paid tens of millions in fines. The company paid over 600 million in fines. They had to, and this was 11 years after the drug had come out, they had to sign a compliance agreement, which was very strict. If we had spoken after that agreement had been signed and they had gone to court, I would have said to you, they're finished with OxyContin. The government caught them, they were brought to court, they had to sign an agreement, and that's the end of the story. And you know what? Not only was I wrong, but the period after 2007 were their biggest sales and their most aggressive marketing. They just went back and did the same thing. They doubled down on it. And what I'm shocked at is that nobody stopped them. We had a compliance agreement with them. The federal government had already been there. Victims and families who had lost children and relatives to opioids were complaining all the time, why aren't you doing something? But it persisted. So part of the frustration of telling this story is to realize that it's like, we got fooled once and we got fooled twice. We were there, the people that represent us as, taxpayer money, as the Justice Department had brought them to justice, and that didn't stop them. They went back and they did it again and made even more money. And that's the part of the story that I find just hair raising here, in the sense that by this time they knew that what they were saying about addiction, they knew it even beforehand was a lie, and they just didn't care.
They do make a good poster child.
Yes, they do. And that
They're not alone, but they make a good poster child.
right. And one of the reasons when you say they make a good poster child, I think they deserve to be at the forefront in many ways because they led the effort with OxyContin. But in addition, and I've talked about this at times with my wife, we do the work on it and then we sort of talk about, well, why this, why that? I think that it's also because they are a private company. And what I mean by that is most of the pharma companies, all the rest of them that have been involved in this, from Teva to Johnson and Johnson to the rest, they're public companies. And if you ask 100 people on the street who the CEO is, they don't know. They can't think of them. They don't know the name. These people change. Maybe after 5 or 6 years, it's somebody else. It's some amorphous board. They all look alike. This is a private company. It's odd. The family owns it. They're easy to know who the family is, and not just does the family own it. So this wasn't a case in which the family owns it, by the way, and then they gave it over to independent business directors to run it, and those business directors got carried away. The family was on the board. They dominated the board. They made the decisions. They were the ones from their old past who knew how to do it. So they are the poster children, as you say, for good reason. We identify them very easily, and they seem to us, with their greed and the naming of public buildings, everything from the Smithsonian to Harvard, the medical school, to Tufts, to the museum in New York, to the London museums, having given away money and having their names put up in granite and now coming down in many cases, they seem very much the example of bad behavior on a deadly drug.
Yeah, sometimes people, there's the term scapegoat, but they deserve it.
That's right. In this
They
case,
deserve all this bad publicity.
that's exactly right. It's very interesting. You'll say, "Oh, that's the fault person," or "They got all the blame and everybody else got off scot-free." There were people who got off scot-free anyway here. That's true, who didn't pay all the costs, but the Sacklers deserve all the bad news they get. I'm disappointed there's not a criminal probe of them. Maybe there will be one day.
Well, with the Army Corps of Engineers, that's the organization that I took on, no one lost so much as a parking spot.
It's so it's fantastic. I often say, I wrote a book years ago on the intelligence failure between FBI and CIA on 9/11, and the most massive intelligence failure in post World War II American history, and nobody lost a job or got demoted or lost a day's pay. So accountability is very odd in this way. It's hard to hold people in government accountable. They sometimes, and that's a shame, because as a result, I can write a bad story about them. You can go out and protest in front. I've seen, the families of the opioid, who have lost children and relatives. Those victims' families have gone to Washington. Right now on fentanyl, there are groups, moms against fentanyl. They've gone to Washington for 2 years in a row. They're in front of the Justice Department and the White House asking for more. Stops the fentanyl coming over the southern border. Do more to crack down on it. Is anybody listening? I haven't seen the action yet. And yet, if 5 years from now we look back and say this, and this should have been done now, is anybody going to lose a job? Probably not. And that's unfortunate.
It is unfortunate. I couldn't agree more. So I wanted to shift a little bit and talk about you and your battles exposing the big guys, which in this case is Big Pharma. On page 323, you were talking about the Sacklers, and I'm paraphrasing a little, but they were paying very little attention to the developments about Ebola and scattered accounts of an unexplained illness affecting visitors to Africa, which we now know was AIDS. And the Sacklers, many of them were doctors, and then while they're interested in new pathogens, they weren't really that interested in either of these two growing incidences, because it wasn't a business opportunity for them. So my question is, so I have two questions. One is, were you ever accused? Now this is harsh. Wouldn't you agree that that was a harsh way to frame the Sacklers? Okay.
Actually, but very fair, and not just the Sacklers,
Fair.
other drug companies as well. They
And
didn't think
drug companies as well, but it's harsh. So my question is, have you ever been accused of being told, well, okay, your facts may be right, I just don't like your tone of voice?
Yeah, I mean, people that think that probably don't say it to me. I'm sure there are plenty of people that think that all the time. And I am outspoken. And I said, by the way, after the publication of this book in March of 2020, as you know, the word COVID doesn't appear in the book because it was written right before COVID was coming out. But I have a second to last chapter called The Coming Pandemic. And I said to a reporter in the first couple of weeks of March that COVID-19 presents a once in a lifetime business opportunity for pharmaceutical companies. Now, there were people that took offense to that. I said it's a cold calculus. I don't mean to say that they're sitting around a table hoping for a pandemic. They're not sitting around a table saying, oh, we hope there's a terrible disease and we can profit from it. But the reason that that was true then, even though it sounds harsh, is pharma is one of the few businesses that's somewhat predictable in terms of what it's doing for the next 3 or 4 years. You go to a company, they know what products they have out now, what the market looks like. They also know what products they have in the pipeline for the FDA that they're hoping to get approved. And if they get approved, they know what their income is. Now, with COVID, you had a new income stream open up unexpectedly for those companies who could develop vaccines and rush to the finish line or therapeutics. You had billions of dollars in annual revenue, tens of billions of dollars that existed, all of a new product line that never was there before. So, of course, they were anxious to get there. And in the case of Pfizer and Moderna, who came up with the vaccines, we now know that it made Moderna, and Pfizer literally became $100 billion a year company as a result of that, double their revenue from everything else. So it's they can still pursue a cure, a fix, a therapy at the same time that they're keeping an eye on the bottom line. That's how we've done it in this country and internationally. And the unfortunate thing about that was we had in 2014 and 15, when I say we, the United States and Europe and other countries had formed a group up in Norway to prepare for future pandemics. And their idea was, if we get a pandemic, all the drug companies will get involved, share the research. Nobody will own the rights to sell the drug exclusively, and we'll price it low so it goes all around the world. And the minute COVID happened, we all forgot about that. So companies were able to own the rights to their own vaccine. They got billions of dollars in government funding. They were still able to make a profit. And, it was back to the races again. So you're right. I am accused sometimes of saying things in a way that is blunt. I think it's honest. People don't like it, but, it doesn't stop me from saying it.
You hit the nail on the head, and I hope everyone was listening very carefully to what Gerald just said. People don't like it. He said, there's nothing wrong with your tone, Gerald.
Yeah,
And when
thank you.
I was standing out fighting the Army Corps of Engineers, there was nothing wrong with my tone. You and I have learned to choose our words carefully, to not get angry. And we've learned that. But still, I was often accused. And as you said, you were too, they didn't like your tone. That's not it. They don't like what you're saying. They don't like your conclusion. And since they don't have a rock to stand on to fight the facts, they go after you
That's right.
by saying they don't like your tone.
Yeah, the oldest trick in the book is you don't like the message, attack the messenger, attack the tone, and if they can get you distracted off on something like that, then it's fantastic. Look, you're dealing often, as you were, you're dealing with government entities and the federal government, so you're dealing with career bureaucrats in many ways. That bureaucracy lets them, sort of slow everything up, and you don't allow that when you're on the attack against them with the facts. And the pharmaceutical industry is the same. I mean, one of the reasons that they prosper so well, it's a confusing industry. And what I mean by that, it's not just how much they set the price at, but they have a lot of different strings that they pull all at the same time. And if they really get stuck, then they use the fear tactic, which is, well, if we get cut back on this and you're going to restrict our price, we won't be able to do the research and development to get the next generation of drugs, and we won't be able to save people's lives. And if you're a person with that disease, you think to yourself, oh, the hell with these restrictions and fair pricing, just come up with a fix so me and my family members can live. I get that. And they play us off against each other sometimes that way.
And they're very, very good at it. So I promised our listeners we were going to talk about Jick and Porter's letter. Gerald, have you ever heard of Deacon Porter's hat?
I don't know, but tell me.
It's a pudding made with currants and raisins. So I look at Jick and Porter's letter and think about pudding.
That's
But
fantastic.
anyway, but we are going to talk about Jick and Porter's letter. For your listeners that aren't aware of the meaning of that, apparently a letter to the editor was written, and Gerald can fill us in with more detail, but a letter to the editor was written to a news source where a doctor and I think a student had done a study to determine whether or not OxyContin was addictive, but they did it in a hospital setting, which was very controlled. And they came to the conclusion that OxyContin had little to no addiction. And this letter to the editor was quoted 608 times, and nobody bothered to ask to see the letter or to see the study. Right? So
Yeah, no, it's remarkable. As a matter of fact, what's something on it is, and it actually turns out to be the basis OxyContin's successful advertising. So it comes out before OxyContin. OxyContin comes out in 96. This letter is printed in 1980. in the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is the most prestigious of all the journals. And what it is, it's a 5 sentence letter to the editor. Now, what's interesting is JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, does a peer review. So you can't publish an article as a doctor in there unless they give it to another group of doctors and they go over to make sure that it's accurate and they test it. Letters to the editor, they don't subject to peer review. So they publish this, and what it said is, we've examined 39,900 cases of people at Boston Hospital, and those who were given opioids for pain, only 4 cases were documented in which they developed an addiction and they had no history of addiction before. Now, what that means, of course, is the time they were in the hospital, 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, they were given opioids for pain. And then when they left, by the time they left, they didn't have an addiction. Nobody followed them afterwards and did a follow-up study of the 39,000, and they were in the controlled setting, as you said, of the hospital, so the doses were given in a way. But over time, that letter was cited by the mainstream press as a breakthrough study. It wasn't a study; it was a 5 sentence letter. Nobody ever mentioned afterwards that it was limited to a hospital. And what the Sacklers did and others is they took that letter and they said, "Look, there's a line in there that says it's got a very low probability of addiction. Only 4 cases in 39,000, so less than half of 1% of 1%. That's what the odds of addiction are." And they would cite that study. So if you were the drug rep going off to a doctor and you said, "By the way, we have this new product, OxyContin, it's 12-hour, works for pain relief, and we think it can be used for this and that," and the doctor said, "Oh, I'm not going to prescribe opioids. That's very addictive." You'd say, "Oh, Doc, you're not aware of the latest studies. There's a study by these doctors at Boston Hospital that show that only half of 1% were ever remotely had an addiction problem." And the doctor says, "Really?" Doesn't read the study, doesn't look at it. That 5 sentence letter helped set the basis for all of the misleading promotion that was later done by companies like Purdue. It's really a remarkable little footnote to the opioid addiction story.
And what I found interesting, that's remarkable, but I keep asking, wait, nobody asked to see the letter or to see the resource or what you call the primary source?
The no, it really is remarkable. And you know that, and to make it worse, the doctor who was involved, you're right, it was a doctor and a graduate student. The doctor who years later was shown how many times it had been cited, over 600 in all these different journals and everything else, was horrified that it had been used in this way because it was such a small thing that they had written off about and so limited. But it goes back to what we were both talking about before, the way that you do your research, the way I try to do it. Why do you want to check the primary source? If you see it cited and it says, by the way, the risk of opioid addiction is very, very tiny based upon a Boston College study, and all you do is cite that study without going and seeing what they did, you're going to repeat the error. And that's what happens time and time again. Now, I don't think, by the way, for the media people like Time Magazine and others who did it, there's any bad intent. They're just cutting corners. They're doing it fast. They're citing it because somebody else has cited it that they trusted, and they do it without checking the original study, and that's a shame. However, in the cases of Purdue and some of the other drug manufacturers, I do think there was bad intent. I think they knew exactly what the limits of that study was, and they didn't care.
Oh, absolutely. But I think so. The big point to our listeners is just ask to see the data and don't stop until you get it. Don't
Exactly.
stop until you get it. Just ask for it. Just ask. So, and then we're running out of time. I know we could go for another hour, but there's something else that you said in your book that I think is so important, not only in your book, but for our listeners. And that was on page 52, I mean, 522. You talk about how by the time the opioid crisis was well into its death count, and had definitely was a national crisis, it became obvious that the doctors were confused about the addiction level of this tamper-resistant pill. Nearly half of doctors erroneously believed that Purdue's tamper-resistant pill was less likely to cause addiction than standard formulations, and that showed the extent to which Purdue's different messaging had caused confusion among primary care physicians, the country's top prescribers. And this is key. I don't know if you realize it, Gerald, but you hit on a key tool the big guys use: confuse.
Yeah, yeah. As a
They
matter of fact,
deliberately confuse
as a matter of
when
fact,
they're talking about something that they're trying to hide.
you're absolutely right. And Sandy, I tell you, somewhere in the book, I don't know where, right off, I can't see the page, but there's a confusion theory or confusion strategy that Arthur Sacker talked about, which is you give them so much information that they actually can't quite pick their way through the thicket, even doctors, and therefore they need your advice and you can lead them to the answer you want. And with Purdue on this, they came up with a tamper-resistant version in 2012 to extend their patent. They needed to come up with some change. It did nothing to reduce addiction. They knew that, but that's how they marketed it. And they also had come up with two fake policies, one called pseudo-addiction, which one of their people thought of, which was you went to a doctor and the doctor said, by the way, my patients look like they're getting addicted to this product, even though you say the odds of addiction are low. The sales reps would say, oh, that's not real addiction. That's pseudo addiction because you aren't giving them enough OxyContin. That's why they look like they're addicts. Give them more and they'll be fine. It's exactly the opposite of what you should be doing. If you were making this for a novel, I would say to you, Sandy, that's not believable. No one could believe that, what looks like addiction isn't addiction. You need to give double the dose. But that's what they did and they got away with it for years.
Incredible, incredible. Well, our listeners and Gerald, we could talk another hour, but it is coming time to wrap it up. And thank you so much for joining me. Is there anything that you would like to share with our listeners before we close for the day?
Yeah, I just want to say, I think that, as individuals, it's very easy to feel overwhelmed when it comes to the drug industry. And especially because doctors are involved. You go in and you see a man or a woman with a white coat and they're telling you what to do. And if you challenge them or question them, they'll say, well, I know better than that. And some people are intimidated by that and back off. You need to be an informed consumer as the patient. You need to do a little bit of research. And when you go in, be able to ask the questions. So my wife, Tricia, a year ago had gone through breast cancer treatment and near the end of her treatment, successful, she's fine now, she's a great warrior, but near the end of her treatment, she had to go for radiation. And they presented an option of doing what they called 15 radiation treatments over a period of time. And we came back with information we had about what's called partial breast radiation, 5 treatments at a higher dose. And we discussed that with them. And it turns out the longevity is the same. The recurrence is the same for her type of cancer. They ended up doing the 5. If we had not asked for that, if we had not been prepared to discuss that with the doctors, they would have gone for the 15. Now, Medicare pays the same amount for every treatment you get, so it's more for the hospital. I'm not saying that's why they would have done that, but I'm just saying be an informed consumer. Know that you have an option, that there isn't necessarily just one choice. If a doctor says to you, I'm going to put you on a hypertension medication because your blood pressure is high, and you think that your pressure is high enough, and they put you on a medication that's costing you $200 a month, find out what the alternatives are that are generic and why he's putting you on, or she is putting you on something that's so expensive. So I'm not saying to go in ready for a fight, but go in as an informed consumer. And in doing that, the doctors will have more respect for you and you will find out sometimes you'll have more control over your own treatment.
And apparently, it's not like with the doctors 100 years ago. It's okay to ask questions of your doctor.
And
Okay.
and if you're with a doctor who it's not okay to ask questions of, you're probably with the wrong doctor.
Great final words. Gerald, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope all of you, the listeners, really enjoyed this episode. Please take a few seconds and go to your favorite platform and rate and like this podcast on your favorite platform. And remember, no matter who you are, you too can beat the big guys.
Sandy, thank you.
Thank you. Stay with me. I'm just going to stop recording.